Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero, and we're here to talk about the happiness science again this week. This week's topic is humour's limits for happiness, and we're here with Dr. Caleb Warren in the actual studio in Melbourne. Very rare for me to talk about the topic. Caleb thinks, writes, and teaches as an associate professor in the marketing department. He thinks about what makes things funny, what makes things cool, and what helps people reach their goals. He writes about these ideas in academic journals, including the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing, Journal of Consumer Psychology, Psychological Science, and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. He teaches consumer behavior enthusiastically, digital marketing reluctantly, and writing experimentally. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Well, I have to begin this conversation by stating the facts that happened today, because it's pretty funny, if you think about it. Well, first of all, I thought that, you're a guest from Australia, and preparing for this podcast, I was like, wait, hang on a second, he's not from Australia. And I was like, oh, so I don't know what happened here. And then I found out that you're on sabbatical and then you're in Melbourne, and then the timing kind of worked out. And then I was like, this is really cool because we've never done this before. And then on your calendar, it was supposed to be for tomorrow. And then somehow we found out, and then you're like, I can get there in 20 minutes. And then you actually made it. And the studio is pretty much fully booked. And I was like, okay, if you can get here, that'd be really great. And it worked out because, before this recording, I actually caught a break. So in a way, it's kind of working out today, I think.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
And I'm maybe not as prepared as I would have been tomorrow, but I know this is what I think about, not all the time, but an awful lot. And I'm really happy to talk to you, share what I know and also what I don't.
Yeah, I think you're as prepared as can be.
Humor and happiness.
I'm sure you're just as prepared as can be because you've studied this. You write about different topics and areas, including this one, and I'm sure we'll have a good time talking about it. The most interesting thing that you told me at the beginning of the conversation is, I'm not funny, so I studied it. I was like, yeah, I like that. So let us know a bit more about that, because I think for all of our guests, there's always a story. And for you, I wonder what it is, because I know that it mentioned here that you're a professor in the marketing department, but it didn't say which university. And also,
the University of Arizona. I think I just clipped the bio from my website, which it's on the University of Arizona website, so it's redundant to say it there. But it probably should have been in the bio I sent to you. Apologies.
Yeah, no, that's okay, because that's where we can dig around and find out more about our guests, right? So you are a professor. You study these things. You're saying that you're not funny, so you study it. So I'm not curious, because you teach us a lot of things: consumer behavior, digital marketing, and writing. And then we're talking about humor.
I've also started teaching marketing communications.
There you go.
So I've switched to more of that and less of digital marketing, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah. So the golden question is why, and how did you get here?
How did I get here?
Not to Melbourne, but in your career.
Well, an airplane. So I guess it started. One of the questions I saw on your list is, what was your favorite course, or do you have a favorite course? And I took a marketing course as an undergraduate student. I didn't really know what I wanted to study because I was interested in most topics as an undergraduate student. Like, I loved history, literature, philosophy, physics. And when I took the marketing class, I was like, this applies to kind of all human behavior. And not only that, marketing is terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what it's doing to me, to the other people around me, to society. I want to study it more. So that's how I ended up in marketing.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned, I study humor because I'm not funny. Some of that's true. In a lot of social sciences, I think people do what's called me search. So things that they wish they were better at. So the topics I study are what makes things cool and what makes things funny.
Right.
So two areas that I could use some work on.
Okay.
I'm not sure they've helped me. Studying has helped me be any funnier or cooler, but at least I now know why I'm not.
Okay. I think that's funny enough for the conversation. So, I mean, you teach a bunch of things, and obviously we're going to talk a bit more about humor in this conversation. I think marketing is a very interesting lens, and, you teach consumer behavior, digital marketing, you said marketing communications, and then writing. So you teach all of these things. Which area would you say to be the most interesting to teach?
Well, the communications are nice because it kind of combines the rest of those topics.
Yeah.
So writing is a form of communication. Marketing communications, to be effective, you need to understand the behavior and the psychology and the sociology of your audience. So that's pulling in consumer behavior. And then increasingly, communications are happening through digital media. So that's where the digital marketing comes in. So I'm very happy. I taught marketing communications for the first time this fall. And I still have some work to do to figure out how to get the class organized right. But I was and am really excited to be teaching in this area. I think it fits my expertise better than certainly the digital marketing. But many of the other classes I had been teaching.
Yeah, that sounds fun. I mean, I think it's going to be very beneficial for our conversation today because I think a lot of marketing strategies are based on humor. And I think there's a limit for that because I don't know if you notice all the different billboards around Melbourne, but there are some that are kind of like, what? Like, are you sure you want to put that on a billboard? Anyway, so we'll talk about that in a little bit in our topic today. And before we get there, we've got a section called Have You Met Caleb? So we're going to get to know you through things that you enjoy, things that you like in life. And first question, my favorite question to ask. What is your favorite book?
I thought a bit about this, and I'm going to go with The Big Short by Michael Lewis, because this is a nonfiction book about one of the more sophisticated, complicated, and boring topics out there, the world of like derivative finance. And it's complicated enough to make anybody's head explode. And Michael Lewis wrote a book that is not only easy to understand, but also super interesting and engaging on this incredibly difficult topic. And what I want to do in my career is channel just like a small sliver of what he can do for this topic to write about things like marketing and humor and coolness and the other things that I cover in my professional career.
That sounds fun. I've never read that book, actually. There's a movie based on it, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so I've seen that like on the list on Netflix, just never watched it.
The movie's pretty good too.
Yeah, I should read that. That sounds good.
Yeah, it blew my mind that something on such a boring topic could be so interesting.
Yeah. I love those kinds of books and movies. And speaking of movie, which one have you been enjoying recently?
Barbie.
Oh, love it. I think probably at least 10 of our guests on both of my shows. This one's the happiness show, and we've got a well-being show called Doing Well. And then at least 10 of them have said, my favorite movie of 2023 is Barbie. Yeah,
the way that they illustrate and play with these different sort of gender narratives and marketing narratives and it was I don't know, it was fantastic, I thought. And very
so good.
Well done and also super entertaining and amazing soundtrack.
I know. So that song, the soundtrack by Billie Eilish just won a Grammy today.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. So I don't know when this podcast is going to come out, but the Grammy is happening today. FYI, 2024. And we were just talking about it earlier before we started the recording. And the song won, I think, soundtrack of the year or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah,
it makes sense.
It is a great song, man. Like I think it just fits in so many different contexts. And you mentioned marketing, and I think that's so true. Like it's just applies to all of us, really.
Yes. I mean, what Barbie did so effectively was they created this sort of gender narrative that spoke to generations of women, of specifically, especially young women and girls, about sort of showing and reflecting what women are supposed to be like. And of course, that led to all sorts of problems.
Exactly.
And it inspired lots of other marketing campaigns that were kind of going against it, like Dove, Real Beauty, and Aerie, sort of like a hygiene brand that played on this too. And then Barbie totally reinvented itself to try to update the story it was telling about who women are and can be and should be. And then the movie just played with all of that. So it's, I thought one of my favorites. For sure.
Definitely. It's so well done. And now let's talk about podcast. So
All right.
You're our guest today. Fun fact is a lot of our guests don't listen to podcast. If you do, which show is your favorite?
I'm gonna mention two if that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
So the first one I'm gonna mention is Solo, which is run by my frequent co-author and collaborator on humor research, Peter McGraw. And this is not a podcast about humor.
Okay.
What Pete has done since, he used to do a lot of research on humor and has a few books there, but he had a book that came out just earlier this week on what it means to be solo, to live without sort of dependency on somebody else. And there are many different forms of solos, but the idea with this podcast is to try to help people who don't want to be paired with somebody else in a world where that's kind of expected. And to try to push back against that narrative that you're supposed to get married and you're supposed to start a family. So that's one. And then the other, that's my favorite, is 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, which is just this great mix of pop culture and music. And the host, Rob Harvilla, is really funny. And he also had a book that came out recently too. And it's far more than 60 songs. I think he's on like song 112 now or something like that.
So that was interesting and I had to take a little break because I remember that last week we actually just did a recording with one of our guests, and I think she has a TED Talk on the topic, very similar to what your co-author, colleague is doing. And she wrote a book called Single at Heart, I think. And we just talked about that topic last week. And now you're mentioning the podcast on the topic. So I think it's really on point. It's not on this show, but it will be released on the Doing Well, our Wellbeing Science show. So I thought that was a fun fact for our audience. So I just throw that in. And if it's out by this point in time when you're listening, we'll make sure to link it. But yeah, I think it's just really related. So thought I would mention that. Now, you gave us two things for podcasts, which we appreciate. What about a role model? Maybe you have multiple.
Yeah, I might give you more than one here too, if that's okay.
Totally.
I think personal role models are largely my parents and then my grandfather on my mom's side. And for professional role models, I think there's two that came to mind. Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist. I think he's at NYU. He was at University of Virginia for a while, and Steven Pinker. And both are academics who do really solid, rigorous academic work, but they're far more than that. They've tried to communicate not only their ideas, but sort of bigger ideas to a larger audience and try to, I think, shift culture and society in a helpful way. So in both cases, they, I think, have moderate voices where they push back a little against sort of the extremes on both sides of the political spectrum. And Steven Pinker is a big advocate of Enlightenment values, sort of individual freedom. And Jonathan Haidt he's making a large push against like social media for children, especially. And I think the way that they combine rigorous academic work with a message that the public can understand is really important. I mean, that's kind of why I think we do the research that we do, is to try to help, especially social scientists, to try to give society better models to work on and improve beliefs, institutions, in democracies, inform voters, regardless, inform policymakers and businesses, if you're in a business school like I am, to make decisions that help them and others.
Yeah. I think that's very important. And, glad to hear that you've got multiple role models that can influence you in that space. And you mentioned the marketing course earlier as, something that was probably life-changing for you in a way. And I wonder if that is the most influential course in your life so far.
I think so. If I had to name one, it would be that because it changed. Marketing wasn't on my radar before I took that class. And once I took that class, it kind of, everything I was interested in, from sort of psychology, philosophy, statistics, sociology, all these different social sciences, like why people behave the way they behave, why they often behave in ways that don't seem beneficial to them or to society. Like a lot of that is driven by these market forces of people, of companies trying to make money, and then people seeing these with whatever their goals are, trying to maximize them in an environment where they're getting these communications. Like we talked about Barbie, and for all these young women, they're being told to be a specific way. And a lot of times I thought that was harmful, but it has the potential to be much more helpful as well. If you look at, I think, some of the newer narratives, even that Barbie is portraying, about how, hey, you can be any type of person you want, any shape, any color,
Definitely.
And if imagining these roles you can take that are a lot more inclusive. So like they have little girls as football coaches and surgeons and professors, rather than just the homemaker, which was sort of the traditional Barbie role.
Yeah, totally. I mean, marketing fascinates me for sure. But I think when I was in my undergrad, because I did a business degree, it terrified me as well, because they actually put a really strong emphasis on, ROI, and then, how you're going to get more customers, and then, target and things like that. And I was like, nope, that's not for me.
I try to push against that, because I think the biggest problem with economics and business schools, because they're trying to create math to explain human behavior, they often simplify utility or happiness, which is really what they're trying to study, by equating it with money, which is a lot easier to measure. And I think that's a huge problem. As I'm sure you've talked about on some other episodes, there's not a one-to-one linear relationship between money and happiness. And then in business schools, a lot of times it's assumed that like profit is the goal, and maximizing profit, or more recently shareholder value, is sort of the good that you should be striving for. And that's hugely problematic. And I think this is true all over the world, but especially in the United States, like workers and many sort of society external forces like the environment are getting gutted by a whole bunch of people who are being trained to make a lot of money for themselves and for shareholders and for the business, without considering the other players. So, I mean, a lot of times it's good for customers and it's good for shareholders, but it's not good for the environment, and for people who work at the companies themselves. So there's a lot of room for improvement in business schools and across the board, and in marketing in particular.
Yeah, I agree, because it terrified me. And then later on, when we started talking about these topics on the podcast here at LMSL, and then also, as you get exposed to all these things, watch movies, see what happens in the world, you're kind of like, oh, that was not taught right, and it's not well done.
Yeah, so all the tools for marketing can be used not to do things other than maximize shareholder value or profit. And if you apply them to that, if you say the purpose of business isn't to make money, but to do something else, and you define that something else as something that adds value. Because the other thing is, some people are motivated strictly by money, but most people are motivated more by other ends, by other goals. So if you define most companies do this to some extent, but a lot of times it's so broad, like we want to make the world a better place, that it's meaningless. So I think if you have a narrower focus, like our goal is to, I don't know, help feed poor people, for instance. So nonprofits, I think, often have clearer visions. But for-profit companies, there's no reason they can't have this vision as well.
Exactly.
And I think if they were to focus more on some goal other than strictly making money for their shareholders, then probably all of society would be a better place. But some of that starts with what people like me are doing in a business school, where we need to advocate and sort of teach better better goals to be optimizing rather than just maximizing profit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that can be a whole other podcast episode in itself, but we digress.
Absolutely.
And we're here to talk about humor's limits for happiness. And you mentioned utility and happiness in the context of marketing and lots of stuff like that. I think it's going to be interesting for the conversation, even though it's not directly related, but I think a little bit, like I mentioned before, with humor and marketing campaigns and things like that. So how do you view happiness personally?
I'm going to give an answer that's not super personal. It's a little bit more academic because I think it reflects my beliefs as well.
Yeah.
So I've read about these 3 different forms of happiness. One is sort of straight hedonic, like pleasure versus pain. Another is more aligned with meaning, sometimes called eudaimonia, but it's about like making a difference. And a third is called psychological richness, which is more about growth, expanding your experiences, knowledge. And I think all 3 of these are different components of happiness, and they need to be somewhat in balance. They all need to be there.
Yeah.
It's hard to be happy if you're like in severe pain or, you're bored out of your mind.
Yeah.
It's hard to be happy if you don't see a purpose in what you're doing. And it's also hard to be happy if you're, not... or maybe this is more like a positive. I'll reframe it. It's easier to be happy when you feel like you're growing as a person and taking in new experiences.
Definitely.
And capturing new ideas, understanding new things, meeting new people. So I think happiness to me is about each of these things and having them all kind of in alignment. And I think, sometimes the problem is people can focus too much on one rather than another. Like if you're constantly pursuing pleasure, then that can get in the way of sort of these longer term goals that maybe is more aligned with the meaning element, doing something that seems worthwhile to you. And same thing with richness. Like that can get, I have a friend who is constantly like, she needs to do something new all the time and seek out new experiences. And sometimes she won't go back to a restaurant that she loves because she's been there before, or she won't order a dish because she's already been there. And it's like, I think, you'd be happier, especially because a lot of times you try something new, it doesn't end up being very good. On the other hand, I think I make the other mistake. I'll go with something that's very routine or that I know I like rather than branching out and trying something new. So it's about, to me, happiness is about balancing these sort of these 3 components.
Yeah. Actually, I agree with you. And I felt like I was being like put on the spot, even though you were not doing that at all. But it was just like, I was thinking in my head when you talk about, pursuing pleasure and not growing as a person. And I think on this podcast, we've covered a lot of definitions. And I've shared a few things on the podcast too. But one of the things that I do focus a bit more on this year particularly is kind of finding that balance that you were talking about. Because it also depends on the context of what a person's life is like. So for example, if someone is kind of feeling like their life is a bit stagnant and they don't find happiness and they're just kind of like, I need something more. Maybe they're lacking a sense of purpose. On the other hand, maybe someone else might be kind of like, oh, you know what? I need a break from everything because it's been too much. I'm burnt out. Then seeking pleasure in that sense to kind of recharge and recover is actually not bad. So I think it depends. Like you need to do a life audit and find out what you need.
Absolutely, because some people get too focused on one of these rather than the other. And I mentioned sort of the richness element, but it absolutely, as you talk about, there's often a trade-off between the pleasure component and the meaning component. You think about the typical workaholic. They're very focused on this long-term goal that's probably meaningful to them, but it can get in the way. It can make you feel exhausted. It can make you feel like you don't have time to, you sip your coffee in the morning or enjoy a stroll through the park or, go on vacation. On the other hand, if you're constantly doing fun things, you might at the end of the day be like, oh, I didn't get anything done. I'm just wasting my time.
Opportunity cost, isn't it? Like it's just like something we hear all the time on the show.
Well, the time is the limiting factor for everybody. And
that's true.
I mean, there's all different sorts of resources that can be limiting factors. And this is why, even though there's not a one-to-one relationship between money and happiness, all else equal, people with more money, they tend to be a little bit happier because it's easier to, and one reason is you can pay for time. Which will give you more opportunities to, like if you, for example, hate cleaning your house. If you have money, you can hire somebody to do that and then spend that time doing something that's either more pleasurable or more meaningful or that adds richness to your life.
So that's one of the misconceptions about happiness, really, because, even though I think that was actually something we discussed earlier in one of the other podcasts today, even though money cannot buy happiness and it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, it does help to a certain extent. And again, it depends on the context. Like, some people might really need it, and it actually adds to their happiness if they have a little bit more money.
Yes. And especially, a total lack of money can definitely get in the way. Like if you're struggling to put food on the table and a roof over your house, or you can't turn the heat or electricity on, like some people can be happy there and it's possible, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah. We as humans just find it hard to appreciate the little things sometimes. And I feel like when that's taken away, that's when we really appreciate it. And then we're like, oh, that made me happy. I didn't realize that. It's so simple, like heating and cooling in my apartment or something like that.
Yeah, there's the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah.
Have you talked about that on this podcast at all?
We are planning to. We haven't.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, especially and this is one reason why pursuing pleasure as a main stake in happiness is a hard long-term strategy, because we tend to adjust to whatever his situation is. So, people who win the lottery aren't any happier years later. They're very happy right away when they win, but then their whole lifestyle changes and that becomes a new normal, and they end up going back to the same level of happiness they had before. Same thing for people who suffer like kind of severe catastrophes. Like they end up being about the same level of happiness years later as they were before it happened. And I think because of that, like that's one reason to not just pursue pleasure as a form of happiness. And if you can appreciate the little things, there's a lot more of those. So you can experience a lot more of these sort of small boosts compared to something really big, which the pleasure is not going to last as long as we think it will. Yeah,
definitely. And one of the little things in life I enjoy when it comes to happiness is humor. Like I have learned to embrace like seeing other people's humor. And I talked to my best friend yesterday, and we was watching a stand-up comedy special on Netflix by Trevor Noah, and I was like, I never enjoyed stand-up comedy, and now I do. And then she introduced me to this comedian that has a really dark sense of humor, and I was like, another thing that I want to share with you. I never liked dark humor, but life happened. Now I like it. So it's just like this little thing. It's most of the time free. Sometimes you pay for it. But, like humor exists in our lives and it adds to our happiness, which is why we're talking about it today. But there's a limit to it, which is why we're covering the topic. So to start off, let's talk about humor. What do you think to be some of the key factors that would contribute to that experience of humor?
All right. Well, I have a theory on this.
Yeah, let's do it.
This is with my co-author, Peter McGraw. When I was a grad student, I'll give you the backstory.
Yeah.
We were studying moral psychology. Peter had some work on this, and I was studying it in a PhD seminar, some of Jonathan Haidt's early work, where he studies moral dumbfounding, sort of when people think something's wrong, but because they're disgusted, but there's not a good reason for it. So one of the examples he gives is like a family that eats their dead pet dog, or someone who buys a chicken from the supermarket and then he has sex with it and then he cooks it and eats it. So absolutely disgusting. People say it's wrong, but then when they're asked, why is this wrong? They can't come up with a really good reason. I mean, he paid for the chicken. It was already dead. No one's being hurt. And I was reading these and just cracking up. So it led to the question like, well, why is something that seems wrong also funny? And that led to not just a theory of why moral violations are funny, but when we expanded this idea of violation to be anything that threatens a person's sense of either their well-being or how the world should be, if you combine that with a second appraisal that things are okay, everything's benign, if you can get both of those appraisals at the same time, benign plus violation, that's when people experience humor. And it works for a lot of different domains. So tickling, for instance, it's an attack, but it's an attack by someone you know and you trust, and it's an attack that doesn't really hurt. So you can tickle someone with a feather, but not a chainsaw. So if you have that attack that's playful from someone you trust, it's a violation plus benign. That leads to laughter. You can't tickle yourself because there's no violation, there's no threat. And if some like creepy person on the street were to try to tickle you, you probably also wouldn't laugh because that would just be a violation. It wouldn't be benign.
Right.
And it works with puns. A lot of times puns involve a double meaning of a word. So, for instance, if you were to tell a baker, nice buns, like, okay, that's a violation. That's sexual harassment. But at the same time, the literal meaning is he's talking about the bread.
Yeah.
And so you get both the benign and the violation appraisal at the same time. If you were to just tell the baker nice butt, that's just a violation. If you were to say nice bread, that's also not as funny.
Yeah.
Because that's strictly benign.
Good theory. Very interesting. It's my first time hearing of that. So you guys are onto something for sure. So if you take that into the wider life context, obviously it happens in different contexts and scenarios. We established that, humor adds to our happiness. How does it actually work, given that theory? And also there's a limit to it for sure. Because, and by limit, I mean two things. So one could be, like you can laugh all day and you'll still be sad. And then the other thing that I would also like to kind of discuss is there's a certain limit to the kind of humor that would add to your happiness, because sometimes it can be offensive depending on how you see the humor.
So humor is not a straight antidote or a straight like pleasure device, or it's certainly not a straight happiness device. Building on our idea that humor comes from these twin appraisals, benign and violation, you can see like the benign piece largely has positive effects, and the violation piece can have negative effects.
Yeah.
So if you think about the different situations where people can use humor tends to have more positive effects on happiness when it's applied in context where something's already kind of wrong, or at least has the potential to be wrong, because the violation exists. The negative part is already there.
Yeah.
And then by adding humor, you're making it seem more benign. You're making it seem okay. So for example, people who are in a disagreement, humor can help smooth that over. If people are coming from different cultural backgrounds or different expectations, or in situations where there's awkwardness or uncertainty, like dating, flirting, the first time you meet somebody, negotiations, all of these places are domains where humor can help. But if you try to force humor into situations where everything's already okay or going well, what you have to do is you have to add a violation to that benign situation, and that can often make things, or it's less likely to lead to happiness. It can often add negative emotions in addition to the humor.
Yeah, true. My brain's kind of going, like doing math, like, yeah, makes sense. Definitely. I think it's interesting too, because you mentioned that violation bit. And I think I mentioned marketing earlier in the conversation, right? Because a lot of marketing campaigns and strategies are built on humor. And sometimes it goes really wrong because it's more violation than benign. And then, it doesn't apply to everyone. So how do you think about that particular context, especially in the marketing world?
Yes. All right. There are three ways humor can fail in marketing and in general, but I think it's very easy to see in marketing. One is it's really hard to actually be funny. Very difficult, because it requires getting the audience to perceive something as both wrong and not wrong at the same time. So these conflicting appraisals, things are a violation, but they're also benign. And that's really difficult to do. You need to know your audience very well. And also, because people have such different both personal and cultural backgrounds, what they see as wrong and what they see as acceptable, what they see as benign and a violation will differ. So even if you're amusing some people, likely others are either not going to see a violation like, oh, that seems normal, or they're not going to see it as benign. To give an example, one of our early studies, we looked at a church that raffles off a Hummer SUV, like this giant SUV, to try to recruit new members. This is a typical marketing tactic, but when applied to a church, some people are like, oh no, this is a sacred institution. They shouldn't be using these mundane marketing tactics. But at the same time, this is what companies do to recruit new members. So people who could see both of those things thought it was funny. Religious folks didn't think it was funny because they were like, oh, that's just wrong. Churches shouldn't do that. And then when we ran the study with business students, they were like, this isn't funny. This is just normal. So the first part of why humor often doesn't help is because it's really hard to make everybody laugh, or even a small amount of people laugh. This is like stand-up comedy is one of the tougher things to do. And comedians usually struggle for decades before they are able to sort of figure out what it is that reliably makes an audience laugh. So one reason why humor has limits. Second reason is the one reason it's used so frequently in marketing and communications is humor attracts attention.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest challenges in marketing. There's so much information out there. There are so many messages. Most marketing communications fall flat because no one pays attention. But if you can make an audience laugh, they will pay attention. But here's the snag. They're only going to pay attention to the funny part. If your humor is not related to your message or your brand, people won't, they're actually less likely to remember the message or the brand than if humor wasn't involved at all. So I looked up a couple of Australian ads earlier to try to give an example here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Okay. There's a Bush ad I found with so this is blind taste test.
Okay.
And this guy's blindfolded, and then there's a host who opens the can of 2 beers. There's a non-Bush beer, and it makes a normal sound, and they open the Bush beer, and it goes Bush. And he's like, well, which one do you like better? He's, oh, that second one, that said Bush. And it's like, well, which brand do you know which one is the Bush brand or whatever? And the guy's like, I don't know. It's like, well, the one that said Bush. And it's not super funny, but it's a little bit amusing. But the important thing is the humor, which comes from the sound the beer makes when opening. Bush is directly related to the brand.
Yeah.
So people are likely to remember it.
Yeah.
There was another ad I saw about, let me see, I'm probably going to get this brand wrong. Bundaberg?
Bundaberg, right? Ate it? Yeah, Bundaberg.
Okay. Yeah, it's like a rum and Coke, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not Australian, so I have no idea.
Okay. And it's a bunch of guys like camping in the woods, and they're trying to hit on this group of women campers.
Right, okay.
And they're like, oh, there's bears that fall out of trees. And the women are like, yeah, whatever. And then a bear falls out of a tree, and they all drink this beer, but it's not really related to the humor. The humor comes from this sort of guys failing to hit on women and then a bear falling out of a tree. It's totally unrelated to the brand. So even if people remember the ad, they're unlikely to remember what the brand is.
Right.
So that's the second way humor fails, is that the ads will create humor, or people doing marketing communications will create humor, but it's not related to the message that they want the audience to remember.
Yeah, I see.
So
tough.
Yeah. And the third way is the most pernicious and also the broadest, because it applies, I think, not just to marketing, but everywhere.
Yeah.
Even when you succeed at making people laugh, even when the audience thinks something is funny, a lot of times the humor, because it has both this benign appraisal and the violation appraisal, can make the audience like you less.
True.
And I think you see this in a lot of times with iconic funny characters in TV shows, like someone like a Homer Simpson or a Peter Griffin from Family Guy, or Al Bundy or Archie Bunker and All in the Family, if we go way back. These are not likable people. You would not want them to be your husband or your father. But they're very funny because Eric Cartman is maybe another example from South Park. Like they're funny because they're constantly doing things that are bad.
True.
So even though you think it's funny, you can also have these negative thoughts or feelings. And a lot of my research in marketing shows that this also happens with advertisements. So firms that create humor and one of the examples I use is a Kia the car ad. They had a Super Bowl advertisement a few years ago with Melissa McCarthy, where she's this eco warrior trying to save trees and trying to save the polar bears, and she keeps getting like maimed or falling through an iceberg or getting cut out of a tree. And this ad is like, oh, you want to save the environment, drive a Kia, but it's kind of making fun of people who want to save the environment. Like they're the ones that are suffering in all of this. And so even though many people thought the ad was funny, most of them didn't like Kia more as a result, because they're like, oh, you guys are just kind of jerks. Why would I want to drive this car when you're kind of making fun of the target audience, environmentalists?
Yeah, definitely. I see where you're going with this. I think it's definitely a very tricky space to be in, especially because it's true. Like even when you find something amusing, most people might not find that amusing. They might like you less if you're the one making the joke. With like brands, they won't like the brand as much.
So that's the first reason most things aren't funny.
Yeah.
Most attempts to be funny are not funny.
It's all relative, really. And I think it's kind of like it depends on the target audience. And, some people might find it hilarious and love it. And others, just like the case that you just mentioned, they're kind of like, oh, I don't like that brand anymore.
But that can happen even when people think it's funny.
Yeah.
So even people, that's what our research shows, even people who think that Kia ad is funny don't like the brand.
Yeah.
Like that adds
that's funny.
hilarious. Do you want a Kia? No.
So that's funny, exactly. Because I like the ad. That's hilarious. Do you want a Kia? Nah.
Yeah.
No thanks.
Homer Simpson's hilarious. Do I want to be like him? No.
Yeah. That applies to so many TV shows that you mentioned that. I'm like, I can imagine where you're going with that. So what can companies learn from this? Because obviously, it sounds like there's no win here. It's going to be a very hard space to navigate, and they want to try to use humor to get to their consumers through happiness, right? And as we've established, they might not like the brand altogether. So what should companies pay attention to?
Not just companies, but anyone trying to use humor can do. There's sort of two lessons, and it relates to the other part of the question you asked about the limits of humor. Is not all funny things are equal. They have very different effects depending on the type of humor or the type of comedy that's used to make people laugh. Yeah. And there are a lot of different ways of thinking about how to divide up comedy. And there's really not a good universally accepted taxonomy for humor types. I think there are two that I find useful. One is called these different humor styles. And the other is building on this idea of violations, because some violations are more severe than others, even if they can both seem benign. So like dead baby jokes, which are about dead babies, are a lot more severe than your average run-of-the-mill pun, which is sort of common wordplay. And both can be funny, but the dead baby jokes are a lot more likely to offend or upset people, even those that find them funny. If you think about the things that the South Park characters are doing and Eric Cartman's doing, like that's a lot more severe than what, I don't know, Jerry Seinfeld is doing in Seinfeld, or I don't know, like a children's cartoon show would be doing. And it's these milder violations that are more likely to have positive effects, less likely to have negative effects. Yeah. And you also need to pay attention to who is threatened by the violation. If it's about a specific person, like aggressive humor, racist humor, sexist humor, any sort of ist humor, or even self-disparaging humor, then it's a lot less likely to have positive effects, a lot less likely to make the audience happy, a lot less likely to make you happy, even making the joke, because it messes up relationships. It is less likely to help people cope with negative problems than if you're able to create humor using a violation that threatens people in general, or social, or like logic norms or linguistic norms. So, for example, taking, you talked about, I don't know, the office next door is an Airbnb and people are sometimes jumping around and things are falling off the wall. Like there, if we were to see that happen, it's not about any one person or group. It's about this shared experience where something wrong happens. And in that situation, humor is a lot more likely to help. Sometimes using the humor styles framework, this gets called positive humor, which is a mix of self-enhancing humor and affiliative humor. So humor that brings people together, humor that comes from reappraising something that seems negative as, oh, this is actually not so bad. So if you can create humor from more of these shared experiences, the shared experience of something that seems off or weird or strange or wrong, then that's more likely to lead to happiness, better relationships, better, at least emotional health, compared to humor that is more sort of aggressive, making fun of other people or even making fun of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, we prepared a question around that because it's actually so hard, right? And you mentioned taxonomy. We love taxonomies at LMS. we want to study things and, in depth. And I feel like when you said there are no agreed upon taxonomies for humor yet, I feel like that promises a really big field of study, because I feel like this is so interesting and there's so many types, and it's a really hard space to navigate. Like, I mean, I know you were probably half joking, half saying the truth when you're like, oh, I'm not that funny, so I learned, about it.
That's truth.
Well, yeah, but it's kind of like, it's pretty funny when you think about it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I think it applies to a lot of people, because they're also kind of like, I don't get humor. Or, they would come across a joke and people be laughing and then like, what's that? It actually plays with a lot of different things in life. Like, knowledge about a certain area. Because, like if I talk to, let's say, a physicist and they're making some sort of physics joke, I'll be like, what? But,
Absolutely.
Somebody in the field of like happiness, well-being, and they would make, jokes about this field, psychology, I'll be like, yeah, okay, I can laugh about that, that kind of thing. So it actually, it's beyond what we know. It's kind of like, it's not just the taxonomies, but also like it gotta applies to the audience that you're speaking to. And I think you mentioned, it doesn't just apply to companies, but also, individually speaking, when you're dealing with other people, and this applies to relationships, to social bonds. You got to know your audience, I guess. That's kind of like the key lesson that I've learned so far. Because I do remember a few jokes that my friends or, like my loved ones made that I was kind of like, I don't know if I like you anymore,
Well,
So,
there's
yeah.
a huge risk of attempting humor, especially if you fail because people don't think what you're saying or doing is benign.
Yeah, it's actually really hard to be funny, like I do agree that stand-up comedians have really tough gigs, but once you like them, you like them.
And I think that's one thing that my co-authors and I have been trying to push against a little is this idea. There's this push, especially in the management and the business literature, to let's bring more humor into the workplace. If we can just have funnier workplaces, people will be happier, because there are correlations between humor and happiness, and managers, leaders who are funny and how successful they are as leaders.
Yeah.
And sort of the lesson, or at least what's being advocated, is try to make people funnier in the workplace. And I'm really skeptical of this advice because I have, over a decade, a lot of my research was trying to look at, well, what can we do to make people funnier?
Yeah.
And in some ways, we stopped doing this because it was so hard.
Yeah.
We have a decade of failed studies with trying to make people funnier, and it's really, really difficult to do that. And not only that, when people try to be funny and they're not, you're a lot more likely to get these negative reactions. Like you offend people, you turn them off, you make them feel like they're not valued or they're not appreciated. And so to tell like an average person, make more jokes in the workplace, I don't think that's good advice, because like most of the books writing this don't have much data backing this up. But the business community, for whatever reason, eats it up. Like there's a Harvard Business Review article that's sort of advocating more humor in the workplace without any data backing it up. And my co-authors and I wrote to HBR and said, hey, can we write a rejoinder piece to this? Because we have all this evidence that if you try to make people funny, most of the time it fails. Like, no, we're not interested in that in that story. That's not the type of thing we want to publish here.
Interesting.
So I think it's a very popular idea that humor increases happiness, and we should try to incorporate humor more in all aspects of life. And one thing that I've found, at least from my research, is we need to be very careful about that.
Yeah.
I mean, because of these different things. Really, it's really hard to be funny. And then even when you are funny, there's a lot of times where humor coincides with negative reactions, negative emotions, negative portrayals of people. And because in order to be funny, you need to do something that's potentially threatening or wrong or offensive to create that humor.
Yeah. What I take from this is, if you are trying to be funny, chances are you're going to offend someone, at least one person.
That depends a lot on the type of humor you're using. So going back to this distinction between positive and negative humor, or mild and severe violations, or sometimes it's called aggressive versus affiliative humor, it depends how you're joking. Like if you're joking about if you're basically, if you think about laughing at versus laughing with, when it's humor that's laughing at, you're making fun of a person or a race or a gender or any sort of social category, then you're a lot more likely to offend. And it's a lot more likely to lead to these negative effects than if you're able to find something that you and the other person, like something that seems wrong to both of you, and change that perception. Like, oh, the camera just fell over because the person next door is
slamming the door.
Yeah, it was like slam dancing during our meeting. Like that's something that we can both experience, and we can both, rather than there's sort of two appraisals. Like, this is messed up, our podcast is being ruined, or look at that, it's messing with this, but it's okay. And then so if you are able to use humor to turn that negative negative to sort of see how like, oh, maybe this isn't a big deal. It's not going to ruin our life.
Yeah.
We can even use it and learn from it or build on it.
Yeah, true.
That if you can use that sort of reappraisal rather than it just being wrong to it's wrong and it's okay, then you'll experience humor, and you'll also that's where humor is so helpful and beneficial for happiness. But the answer to the problems in the workplace or elsewhere isn't take a situation where everything's good and then try to add humor to it.
Yeah,
that's more likely to, I think, end poorly.
Yeah, no, that's dangerous territory. I think workplace is a space where humor can really play against your benefit. Anyway, we're kind of going in depth, and I think there's so much more to be discussed, but I'm very conscious of time. So I'm going to stop myself from making further comments because I would love for us to get practical for our audience. So people that are tuning into this podcast episode are probably here because they want to learn more about humor. Maybe they're like a little bit like yourself, where they're like, I'm not that funny. I would like to be a bit more funny. Now, we're here about happiness. So if we were to talk about a practice or something small that our audience can try to maybe incorporate humor into their lives to boost their happiness, but within the limits that you just mentioned, what would be something you recommend to them?
All right, I have two recommendations. So the first is focus less on being funny and more on appreciating humor.
Yeah.
Because even though it's really difficult to be funny, it's not difficult to laugh.
Yeah.
If most people have a sense of the people in their lives who are funny and the content out there, the movies, the books, the TV shows, the magazines, whatever it is you consume that make you laugh. And I think even though the benefits of trying to be funny are mixed in large part because it's really hard to do that, there's a much more direct benefit, especially on the sort of pleasure element of happiness and humor appreciation. Yeah. So I think seeking out more people, more situations, more content where you're likely to laugh can be, it's a doable and it's an effective strategy. Although if we go back to sort of these different components of happiness, it's more effective on that pleasure or hedonic component. It's less likely to help the meaning component. And in some ways, appreciation might get in the way of a meaningful pursuit because it's signaling things are okay. And a lot of times what drives people to do meaningful things is there's a problem, a big problem that affects more than them that they want to fix. Yeah. And humor can signal like, oh, don't worry about that. Everything's okay. Yeah. So, but humor appreciation, being more intentional and seeking that out, I think can help with especially these sort of small pleasures in life. And that's something anybody can do.
Yeah, great tips. I think the part about, seeking out things that you find funny or, appreciating humor, that we can all do.
Yes.
Yeah. Not take things too seriously is actually quite hard.
Yes. Well, and especially the time where this is especially important is when things don't seem to be going well. Yeah. Because if things are already going well, humor is not going to help. You don't need it. Yeah. But and if something's a serious problem, humor is not going to help you fix the problem. No. But there are so many things in our life that either we can't do anything about or that really aren't a big deal. Like we're driving down the street and there's an idiot driver that cuts us off. You can get really upset about that and let it ruin your day. Or you can laugh like, oh, what a fool doesn't know how to use his blinker or whatever it is. Or what I keep doing driving here is turning on the wipers rather than the turn signal because I'm all backwards. So I could get really frustrated and be like, oh, Australia's are driving on the wrong side of the road or I could be like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. I can't even keep my turn signal straight and laugh about it.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's where humor can help. So my other tip is if you are trying to be funny, pay attention to how you're being funny. And at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, the easiest way to be funny is to use that kind of aggressive humor or self-disparaging humor. Make fun of yourself, make fun of other people. But that's the worst thing to do if you're trying to increase the happiness of yourself or those around you. Yeah. Instead, look for sort of these shared common experience where something seems wrong or off or and then if you can make light of that or make fun of that, that shared experience, that word that doesn't make sense or the situation we're all in, that's the type of comedy that is more likely to make you and the audience and the people you interact with happy.
Yeah, true. It's something to be learned, I think, because it's actually a life skills to be able to laugh at certain situations. I think the interesting thing that you mentioned there that I want to build on is, about the share experience, because sometimes I think the challenging part is distinguishing between laughing at the situation versus the person that it is affecting.
Yeah.
Because I have found this to be a little bit hard to navigate. Like, I have two examples that I can give. One is probably 2 years ago. I still remember it because like it was so weird. I was like, oh my God, like, did I laugh? And was that wrong that I laughed? Because my friends and I, we went out, and then it was actually my friend first, and then her partner came along, and we were having coffee, and then we were like, okay, let's go. She said, my partner's here, let's go. We're gonna get some cake, and I was like, okay, let's do that. So he went into this bakery, and then he got the cake, and then he came out, and then she was like, do you want one? I was like, sure. He opened the box, and it was like the complete opposite of what he was gonna get, and so she and I started laughing, and his face turned completely blue. And we were laughing at the situation because the shop gave him the wrong cake, but he thought we were laughing at him. And I found out about that when we stopped laughing, and I realized that he was not laughing at all. And I was like, now I feel horrible.
Yeah. I mean, that's a potent example of how different people will interpret that situation differently. For him it wasn't the bakery messed up, it's I messed up.
Yeah.
And then
we were laughing at the situation, not him.
And then also for him it wasn't benign.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really relative depending on how the person sees the situation as well. So violation and benign. I find that combo now to be interesting because that can be applied to all the examples that I can give ever.
It's not a perfect theory. Like there's some holes in it, and there's ambiguities. Like, well, what does it mean to be a violation, and what does it mean to be benign? But we think it does a better job of the other theories that were out there. Like,
I think it makes sense. It depends on the person, though, because for some people, kind of like, this is a violation. For others, it's kind of like, oh, maybe it's not.
Right, but that's a strength of the theory.
Yeah,
because people have very different senses of humor, and they're offended by different things.
Yeah.
And the leading theory before it was humor comes from incongruity, and incongruity can mean a lot of different things, but the most common meaning is something that's unexpected. And it's really easy to show unexpected things that are not funny, like running your friend over with a car by accident, unexpected, not funny. And then we often will enjoy the same things over and over again. So in South Park, one of my favorite TV shows, they killed the same character every episode for the first 100-something episodes. So people knew it was going to happen, but they thought it was funny.
Yeah.
And there are these great studies in academic research where they would take stand-up comedy and they'd cut the stand-up off just before the punchline of the joke. And then they'd have people guess what the punchline was going to be. And when people were more likely to predict the punchline, they thought it was funnier. Other people thought it was funnier.
Yeah.
So more expected is actually sometimes more funny. So it's not really about expectations.
Yeah, true.
So we think it does a better job than other humor theories, but there's still a lot of research to do to improve either overhaul this theory. Maybe we're wrong altogether, or at least I
think you're onto something.
At least to specify, well, what does it mean to be benign? What does it mean to be a violation? How is it? Like at different levels, like within the brain, within social situations, with aggregate, like across a culture, what do different people perceive as okay versus not okay? So that was, I guess, my rant on something I find very interesting.
It's very interesting because when you mentioned that expectation bit, I was like, that's true, because sometimes I find certain jokes or bits really funny even before they start, delivering the punchline, or before the situation actually unfolds, because you knew what was coming. You knew it was funny. You were laughing before it actually happened.
Right, because there's the violation, there's the benign piece, and a lot of times violations are unexpected because we expect the world to go according to the way we think it should. But other times it's not at all, and being, especially the second and third, fourth time you've heard a joke or seen a funny movie or read a funny book, like there's still something in it that seems wrong or off. Like, so in South Park, it's Kenny dying. Like, that's still, the character shouldn't die. But at the same time, one reason that's benign is because he's going to be back there in the next episode. He's not actually dead. He's dead. He's not dead. Fair enough. Even though you expect it, it still has that benign and violation component. Same thing with like tickling. That person's going to tickle you, but that doesn't prevent it from making you laugh if, if you trust that person. And,
Interesting. Like this can go on forever because I feel like this is very interesting and there's just so many examples we can give. But I think we've covered quite a few tips for our audience and hopefully this helps them because, there's more on the, practical side and there's more of the studies and discussion. So now before we wrap up, let's have a little bit of time to, get you to do your open mic. This is your platform to talk about anything you would like to share with us. And I know you've got a few things in mind, so go for it.
Sure. All right. So I'll start with the other part of my professional life. So the other big topic I look at, I like to say I research what makes things funny and what makes things cool. My dissertation research, before I started studying humor, I was fascinated in coolness, which seemed to drive so much of why people buy stuff, why people do things, like why they buy $100 pair of jeans or go helicopter skiing or, listen to the Strokes, who were sort of big when I was in college. So I have a bunch of research on this, and I'm currently working on a novel where I'm trying to explore some of the ideas I've found in my academic work through the lens of a character who he's a teenager, ages from middle school through college, who's sort of trying to be cool and tell the different sort of ideas about what makes things cool through the perspective of this character that's trying to pursue them and is consistently failing. And some of the limitations of also even why you'd want to be cool, because like humor, it's a mixed bag. I think in terms of happiness, I'm not sure coolness is the right strategy to pursue. Because really, it's a different form of status, social status. So that's sort of one area I think a lot about. And then personally, I'm in a rock band. We're called Band of Townies. We do originals and we do covers. And if you're interested in hearing us, or I have a blog that's related to music, sometimes I cover academic stuff there as well. You can check that out at bandoftownies.com.
So that covers both your professional work and your rock band?
Yes.
That is so cool. I love that. And that is the website for the audience benefit.
So there's the professional website is calebwarrenresearch.com.
Right.
And the band website is bandoftownies.com. And if you want to see the blog, bandoftownies.com/blog.
Okay. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's such a fun conversation. Honestly, we could go on forever, but I think we should stop so the audience can actually digest humor in the context of happiness. Lots to digest, to be honest. And I believe it was definitely challenging for you to kind of, dissect all the funny stuff in a not so funny way. So this is kind of like, you learned about humor in a very serious way. So I would give that to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah. You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.